All right, hello, this is Jeff Scott of Black Hawk Technical College, and I will be coming at you right now with the last presentation that I'm going to do for the 152, 161 ASP.NET class. I'm taping this from my kitchen, so if there's background sounds or whatever, I guess I apologize in advance. Chapter 15 starts on page 539, and as you can see, it is entitled Working with Data Advanced Topics. Now, the thing about this chapter, just so you know, is the majority of stuff in this chapter is what I would refer to as being aesthetic in nature. So in other words, more or less, the author has already explained to you the stuff that you'll need in order to be able to work with databases and be successful working with databases. But now he talks about how to play with and do some work with the formatting. And he goes back to an earlier chapter, I believe it was around 6 or 7, where he talked about styles and themes and skins, etc. So these are discussed again, as you can see in our list of objectives. He also talks about how to handle the different events that are fired by data controls, again, to change their appearance conditionally. So one of the things that we'll talk about in here, and you'll see this early on, is how to do zebra striping. So he goes and he runs a query, and to try to make the stuff that happens in the query look a little bit more, again, aesthetically pleasing, he does some zebra striping. Then later on in the chapter, he comes in and he says, let's go in and, for example, if we've got a genre and that genre still has reviews in it, if you remember, that means we can't remove that genre because the reviews are a foreign key into the genre table. And so what he says is check, and if that genre has a review associated with it, take the delete button and gray it out, disable it. All right, so that's something he does conditionally. He discusses how to hand the user interface of data access pages, how to hand code it to give you more freedom, because with some of the stuff that you use in here, although it's very well done, you're somewhat hamstrung over the fact that it's an all or nothing proposition. It changes everything or it changes nothing. Finally, the chapter ends with talking about computer caching and why you might want to use that. So he mentions here chapters 12, 13, and 14, the previous 3 chapters, allowed you to understand the core concepts of data access. And as it says, they mainly focused on the data source controls and the principles behind them. So in other words, we created things that look like this. And there's nothing wrong with what we created here. It works well. It may not be the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world, but again, it works well. It does the job. But here they start to talk about using styles. So they talk about converting this that you see right here into something like you see right here. All right. So as he mentions here, for example, the column for the edit and delete is now a little wider. The ID column was hidden because there really is no reason to show it. The select part of edit and delete is not shown anymore. There's different colors for the header, the footer, and the alternating items. Again, you can see that the delete on some of these has been disabled because those particular genres currently have reviews associated with them. And since they do, and since the review is a foreign key, you can't remove the parent because that would leave orphan records. Now they mentioned, starting on the bottom of the page here, it says changing the dull-looking grid from 15.1 into a snazzier one in 15.2 is established using ASP.NET styles. All right, so I wouldn't even call this an introduction to styles, because in somewhat it's a reintroduction to styles, because again, styles was discussed in an earlier chapter. So they mention here, for example, the grid view control has row style and alternating row style properties that allows you to customize the look and feel. So you can go in and do things like this. So notice with the alternating row style, the background color is white. And as we just saw on here on the previous page, every other row is white. All right. So you can come in, and they really haven't done all that much. Here, the row style, the other color is kind of a gray or whatever you'd want to call it. But the idea is, with not a lot of work on your part, you can create something, especially if you're creating it for an end user, that is much more aesthetically appealing. All right, starting on the bottom of page 541, they show some of the properties here that you're able to dink with. You've already seen, for example, the back color. There's also forecolor, which will play with the text color. Border color, border style, border width. And as shown on the next page, one thing that you really shouldn't forget about is this CSS class. And we've talked about this before, again, in earlier chapters. As mentioned there, the CSS class allows you to assign a CSS class instead of doing inline style information. It says you should give preference to the CSS class property over individual style properties because they minimize page bloat. And they also allow you, when you create a CSS class, to be used over and over again in an application. You've got your standard font stuff with font size, font family type of things that we've talked about, back to the days of HTML. They do mention here that if you want more on this, and I'm not going to bring that up, but the whole style class, here's a shortened URL. I'm just going to block it for now if you want to take a look at what's there. All right. And they mention that the different data-bound controls have different sets and styles, but they do share some in common. So, for example, it says here the following table lists the available styles for the grid view, and it describes their purpose. The other data-bound controls have slightly different styles, but the ideas are similar. So again, you already saw the row style and the alternating row style. You can set up a selected row style. So for instance, if you have clicked on a certain row, you can change its color, its font, whatever it is you want to change. There's edit row style, which, as it says, you can apply to rows that are currently in edit mode. There's empty data row style, where you can define the look of a row that's displayed when the grid is bound to an empty data source. There's header styles, footer styles, page bar styles, and different styles associated with sorting. Now, please notice right under this table, so I've got it in blue right here, the author mentions that there are some controls like the repeater and list view that have no styles. So you're free as a developer to define them in any way you want, but you're probably going to feel or realize you're not going to have nearly the luxury you have with some of the other stuff. So in the first try it out that starts on the bottom of 543 and it goes on to 544 and 545, the author says, let's use the built-in formatting capabilities of Visual Studio to change the appearance of a grid view control. Now that's kind of a nice one to do when you think about it, because remember, a grid view looks a lot like a spreadsheet. So by making a few fairly simplistic changes, it can have a dramatic aesthetic effect on your page. So they ask you to open up the Genres ASPX page, switch to Design View, open the Grid View Smart Task panel, and all they're asking you to do here is, when you do that, is to auto format. And what they mention here is when you do that, you're going to notice a big difference. They tell you to choose Classic, but you'll notice you have somewhere around 10 or 15 possible styles in here. Once you choose one, and again, they ask you to choose Classic right there, but once you choose one, what you'll notice is a lot of stuff gets added to your actual page, because when you choose one of those styles, it has all sorts of associated markup that goes along with it. I'm sorry. right, sorry about that. So let's get back into it. Again, they have you make these changes. And what you will see after you get done, you don't see it in here, but it'll look very much different with very little work on your part. All right, and literally it's a matter of going in, choosing the smart tag, and choosing auto format. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but to a lot of people, you don't want your page to look like a lot of other people's pages. In other words, you want to be able to go in and change stuff yourself. So in the next example that's here, that starts on the bottom of page 545, the author comes in and says, you move various style properties from the genre.aspx page into a separate skin file. Again, you should already understand the reason for doing this. And the fact that if you put that stuff into a separate file, that skins file is now available throughout the project to any page that wants to use it. So you pull out some stuff and you create it, you throw stuff, whatever you want to throw in there, etc. But again, the idea behind doing that is for a consistent look and feel. Now notice the author even mentions you can set up, you can go into your web.config, and this time you're going into the web.config for the management folder page, and you're setting a theme. So what does that mean? That means that if you are in doing management operations, so if you're going in there to add accounts, remove accounts, update accounts, etc., anything in that management area, it'll have its own color scheme. An advantage of doing that is people would be able to look at it, hopefully at least, and know right away that they're in a different part of the site, because it would look aesthetically different than what you would see in the regular part, the non-management part of the site. All right. So they mentioned jumping up all the way here to page 549 at the top of the page. By moving your control style declarations to a separate skin file, you've created a very flexible, maintainable solution. And that's really, when you think about it, it's what you're shooting for. All right, the next thing that they go into in here is event handling. And they mentioned that previous chapters in this book have talked about how you can raise events. We've done something as simple as react to a button click event. And they mentioned you need to have an understanding of the events that fire during a control's life cycle. And what they'll do in here is they'll talk about some of the basic steps that are in the Asp.Net Control Lifecycle. And as mentioned here, you won't see every one of the events because there's just a lot of them. And there's many of them for which you'll put little to no code in. Now we can come in here if we wanted to. We could come in here, and so I can come into Google Images, for example, and I can type in Asp.Net page lifecycle. And I can get a lot of pictures. And some of, most of them will look pretty similar to one another. Some of them will be, as you can see, squares. Some of them are circles, etc. I think this, I don't remember if this is the one that I've used before, but there's a few in here that aren't too bad. All right. And as you know, again, this is not everything. All right. But they're going from browser request all the way through to the response that you're going to get. All right. So again, as you know already, or should know, there's different events like pre-init, load, pre-render, unload, and there's a lot of other events. All right. So what they have you do in the next exercise here is they have you create kind of a garbage page on page 550. So I guess I jumped past it right away. It says to give you an idea of the different events that you can hook into during a page's life cycle, let's try it out as you set up a page that displays some data from the genre table. You also add a button that you can use to trigger a post back to see how that influences things. So they have you create a new file called events.aspx. Switch to design view, throw a grid view in there, and allow sorting on the grid view, and set it up again so that it does a post back. One of the things I wanted to show you though is if you look here, how many times have you seen this stuff? That something, for example, ends with either an ed or an ing, which means, for example, here your information has already been sorted. Here it has not. All right, so you can put different code into different parts of this life cycle to have different things happen. And that's what I think, at least, what the author is trying to get across in this particular example. Under the how it works, the author mentions here on 553, this isn't a complicated example. You set up a bunch of event handlers for the various controls on the page. Inside the event handler, you call a method that checks whether the page is currently loading for the first time or loading due to a postback. Jumping up to page 555, and again, my goal is to spend somewhere in the neighborhood of a half an hour hitting a couple of the high points in here. All right, I have no idea if anybody is ever even going to watch this. So one of the things that I'd be very interested in is if you did watch it and it did help you, or you did watch it and it did not help you, if you'd let me know. And please remember, I've got this, I'll have to show it to you, and I will. That somewhere, this is going to take a second to find, but I do want to show you this. Somewhere out on the P drive for the class, so P:CIS 152, 161, fall 2015. All right, there's the source code. So if you wanted to go back and look at all the source for this particular chapter, which is chapter 15, there it is. It's built as one big project. I mean, I can bring that up and walk you through the stuff, and maybe that's the way I should have done this. I don't know, just a right mouse click, drag that out here, copy it here. But by doing that, these lectures would have been a lot longer, and just being totally frank with you, I don't have a lot of time to go through and do a lot of these lectures. That's one of the reasons why, as mentioned previously, they're more hitting some of the high points in nature than they are anything else. But you'll notice if I do a file, open, come on, open, website, and I look in here and I find the stuff from chapter 15, there it is. All right, and I don't want all that stuff. I just want to click on the chapter 15, click open, and now everything is out here. So if I want to go back now and take a look at some of this stuff, as shown in here, so again, for instance, because I'm not very far into the chapter, all right, somewhere in here is the genre. It might be under management. There's the genres. All right, if I bring that up, because they've already gone and created a bunch of stuff and put a bunch of stuff in here, let's try to run this and see if we've got that information. In other words, did we get that alternating or zebra row type effect? Now, hoping I get no errors messages in here, because this is the author's code, of course, it's not my code. And you can see how the delete for some of these has been grayed out. You can see the zebra striping, and ideally you can see there's a different color here for the header and for the footer area. Okay? Again, this is what the majority of this particular book is about. All right. Okay, it says inside of the demos folder, they want us to put in here, there should be the events.aspx page. So I'm going to open up that one and I'm going to bring it up. This again was the example that I was just going through. All right, so they're showing you everything that's happening in here. All right. So they're saying post back. So basically it's the first time, so we had to fill this stuff up. If I click a button, there'll be other things that are going to happen. Okay. Again, this is the Planet Rocks genre, or the Planet Rocks project that they're working on. That's the dark gray theme. There's the monochrome theme, so you can see the difference between them. All right, one of the next things that's discussed in here, it says, as previously discussed, the grid view raises the row created in the row data bound events for each row it adds. These events are ideal to peek into the data, and based on that look that you have into it, take or not take appropriate action. So in this example, as mentioned here, they write an event handler. All right, within the events, you can diagnose the data item that is being bound to the grid row to see whether or not it has reviews attached to it. If there are reviews attached to it, then you can disable the delete. So what they're saying is they're disabling that delete in here, but they're doing it programmatically. And when you think about it, how else could they tell? Somehow you have to have a look, and you have to be able to search and look at whether or not there have been associated reviews. And if there have, of course, that's when you want to take the delete and you want to disable it. All right, let's jump up to page 560, and as the authors discuss in here, handling errors that occur in data source controls. All right, Chapter 18, which I've already gone over in class, talked a little bit about exception handling, and it demonstrated how to catch errors that occur in code and handle them in the way you want to handle them. But they mention here that the SQL data source control and the other data source controls give you information about errors that occur during one of the four CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete. All right, it says with the SQL data source control, all four events accept an instance of this event arg, and it has two important properties: an exception property and an exception handle property. It says the exception property contains the actual exception that occurred, or nothing, or null in our case for C#, when everything goes according to plan. All right. It says if you decide to handle errors in the event handler, you should set the exception handle property. So again, we're talking about errors you could come up with and how you can handle them. So in the next example that starts on the bottom of 560, it says you'll see how to deal with exceptions that occur in a grid view when you delete rows. So what they have you do is they have you comment out the code that we just put in to remove those, so that delete that we had in there, that we grayed out, it's no longer grayed out. Then they have you go in there and literally go in and remove a row in the parent table that still has child records. And they put the code in there for it here on the top of page 562. And you see that if you do that, it fires. When you click the delete link, the grid view triggers the delete command on the SQL data source control. The control tries to send the delete statement to the database. The database then tries to delete the requested genre, but it finds that it can't do that because, again, the genre is the parent and the review is the child, and there are associated reviews to it. So it results in a foreign key constraint error, and it comes up and it gives you an error message. All right. All right. Jumping up to page 564. The author starts talking here about halfway down on the page, hand coding data access code. And the author says, the biggest issue I have with the data controls is the amount of markup they require. All right. It can make it cumbersome and time consuming to make a lot of modifications. But it's like anything else. It's hard the first time or two because it's not so much that it's even hard, but it's a little bit laborious to do. All right. But doing it yourself, you get a lot more flexibility. All right. So they mention here that it's not that difficult and you get a lot of flexibility in return for the extra effort. So the next example that starts on page 565, that next try it out that you see here, it says we create a new version of the add edit review page to replace the existing one. In the new page, it says you add form controls to enter the review's title, summary, body, and genre and whether or not it's authorized. In the code behind, it says we're not going to add any validation controls, but you should do that. And what we're doing is, again, in this particular add edit review, we're trying to do customization. Let's jump into that one. Stop the run here. I believe that is back. There it is, add edit review. Here's hand coded. So let's look at both of them. So here's add edit review. So this is the one that we built, or the author built several chapters back. Okay, there's the add edit review. So I can come in here and say, I don't know, punk rock rocks. All right. Summary, positive review of punk rock concert. This concert was great. It blew me away. All right, and it's authorized. I insert, and it's now in there. All right, now let's contrast that, what we just looked at. All right, let's go back and we'll run the hand-coded example. Again, this is in your book on 565, 566, 567. And you notice it doesn't really look much different. All right? But we have control over this where we didn't before. Again, the author didn't put it in, but if we wanted, for example, in the summary, if it had to be a certain number of characters, or if there were words we could or couldn't say, etc. So I can do the same thing in here. Another, a pop review. Powerful concert. This concert was great. So that's another one that's been put in. All right. Punk rock rocks. There's my one I just put in. All right, you can see it. And if I go down to pop, there it is. All right, so it didn't matter, but the idea is I've got a lot more control over what's happening behind the scenes when I hand code it. So we'll end up with a page in the end that's much easier to maintain when we get all done. All right, because again, we've got control over what's happening here. All right, I don't want to get off on too big a tangent, so let me jump back into the book here, jump up all the way to page 574, and talk a little bit about caching. All right, my hope is that I have exposed you to the idea of caching earlier in the semester or in some other class. As they mentioned there, caching is one of the best and easiest ways to improve performance in an application. When you cache, a copy of your data is stored at a location so that it can be accessed quickly. The idea with caching is that fetching data from a cache should be faster than generating or regenerating it from the original data source. All right? So they show an example of it pictorially here on 575. Now, there are problems when you cache, and those are mentioned a little later on the page here. You can end up with stale data. All right? In other words, the data is out of date. So for example, with a database, you might have the most current copy at the time you cached it, but there may have been reviews or even genres that have been added since then. All right? The other thing too is you can assume, because you're working with an old copy, that you can assume something is there when it isn't. In other words, there could be a review there that somebody decided to remove, but since you've got an older cached copy, that review will still show. So as mentioned on the bottom of the page, stale data is cached data that no longer matches its original data source. So how do you get around that? To avoid it, it says you need a way to invalidate the cache. So you need to be able to look at it and say, oh, it's changed since the last time we were here, so we have to go back basically and regenerate it. For the second one, as mentioned here, don't rely on data being there. All right? There's different cache strategies that you can use with ASP.NET. It says you can do output caching, caching with built-in data source controls, and programmatic caching. Each one of them has their advantages and disadvantages. With output caching, as mentioned on the bottom of page 576 and going on to 577 and 578, the end result of the rendered page is cached. So the first time the page is requested, its final result is added to the cache. All right? So every time you make requests to the same page, what's going to happen is the same HTML is going to be sent. So that means the page is not processed at the server again. All right, so you're going to get the same copy. Now what's important in here is how often you want that to happen. So here you notice that we've got the duration is the number of seconds that you want to cache the page before ASP.NET creates a new copy of it. Especially when you're working with a database, anything that's very transient in nature, that's going to change often, you want to set that duration time to be very short. For instance, if you were working at a ticket, let's say a ticket place, where people were constantly buying tickets, you're not even going to have your duration be 60 seconds. All right. So one of the problems with output caching, as mentioned on the bottom of the page here, is it's an all or nothing scenario. The author mentions, although it's easy to cache different pages based on different types of values, all right, you'll need to write custom code to handle other situations. So it can be a lot of work. So one solution is mentioned here on page 578 at the top of the page is to not use output caching at the page level and move the content that applies to all users to a separate user control. All right. Another one is to instruct the data source controls themselves to do the caching for you, and that's the second type. That's mentioned on the second half of page 578. And it says the biggest benefit of doing this is they only cache dynamic database-driven data, not the entire page. All right, the data source controls are smart enough to see if you're making updates to the underlying data. So this type of solution is very useful in a lot of different situations, but it can't be used in every situation. For example, if you want to cache the results of data that you're getting from a different data source, you're not going to be able to do this. In that situation, you're going to have to use what they start explaining on the bottom of page 578, and it goes on to 579 and 580, and that is programmatic caching. And as mentioned down here on the bottom of the page on 578, starting on the very bottom of the page, the author mentions here, with programmatic caching, you can store items in the cache through your C# code. All right. Well, you can also access them again later. You use add and insert methods of the cache collection property. And they show you an example here on page 579. There's an insert example right there. The insert method is fairly easy to use. They mention it has few short overloads that make it possible for you to specify the cached item and associate it with a key. Turning up to page 580, it says to access the items in cache, you have a few options available. You can access the cache collection entirely, as they're showing right here. All right. In addition, as it says, you can use the get method that expects some kind of key, like you see right here. So the very last example, as I finish this up here, all right, that the author mentions, it starts on page 580. In that last try it out that we'll talk about a little bit in here, it says you see how to cache a review instance you get from the entity framework using link to entities, so it can be retrieved later by its key. All right, and that's what's shown here in step 6, I believe it is. Nope, step 5, I guess, on the next page. It says you should now see the details of the review being displayed on the page. All right, it says, although you might not see any difference from what we did before, the review now comes from cache. So for example, if you constantly were using the same review to show people maybe how to create a review or a popular review or whatever, you could be caching that review and bringing it up, which would result in a performance increase. You know, it would take less time to bring stuff up. All right, and finally, on page 585 and 586, bottom of the page. So we've reached the end. They give you I think it's about 4 practical tips here. First one, whenever you use numerous style properties of the data-bound controls, consider using the CSS class property to avoid page bloat. Talked about that before. Secondly, on 586, the section about the controls lifecycle had an exercise that shows you how to display the various events and the order in which they occur. This was not a totally complete example because there's other things that were not shown in there, so you could extend that example. Third, when you're writing pages that access a database or other slow or scarce resources like files or web services, consider whether or not they can benefit from caching. And finally, consider hand coding complex data access pages. They're a little more difficult to write at the beginning, but they can provide a lot of latitude for you as you go on. And that does finish up the last example, the last chapter that we have in the book. So again, if you did look at these and you have comments, pro or con, please let me know. Thank you.